Hello class. Today's module is going to be about the human skeleton. If we look at our learning objectives, uh, again, remember this is basically your study guide. This is what you need to know coming into the exam. Now, the human skeleton is made of different kinds of tissue. Typically what we think about when we hear human skeleton or skeleton, we're thinking bone, right? But it's not just bone. It's also cartilage, which we also talked about in the context of connective tissue. And then we have ligaments. Ligaments join bone to bone. Your skeleton makes up 20% of your body mass. There are 206 bones in the human body, and we can divide the skeleton into two components, essentially. We have the axial skeleton, which includes your head, the bones on your head, cranial bones, and facial bones, right? Your vertebral column, and then your ribs or your thoracic cage, right? The bones that encase your thoracic cavity. And then we have the appendicular skeleton, which includes the bones of the arms and the legs. The diagram on the right is quite useful because it color codes the two components of the skeleton. Your skeleton has many important functions. And well, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of functions, we say, well, structural support, right? You're able to walk upright because you have the skeleton that supports everything else. Also, protection of internal organs, like when you look at your skull, right? Your skull is protecting your brain. And then you look at your ribs and all those associated bones are protecting some of your most important organs, like your heart and your lungs. Skeletons are also, or your bones are also places for muscle attachment. So this helps you with locomotion, moving around. And that's generally what comes to mind, or what immediately comes to mind when we think about the skeleton, but it has many other functions that are also important. For example, hematopoiesis, which is blood cell formation, and this occurs in the red bone marrow. And then triglyceride storage. This is in the yellow bone marrow. Triglycerides are just fat molecules, and this is just energy storage. Then we also have calcium and phosphate storage. Calcium levels, regulating calcium levels are very important because calcium is used by both muscle cells and nerve cells. It has important roles in both of them. And then we have osteocalcium production. And osteocalcium is one of the hormones that is involved in glucose homeostasis, so it helps regulate your blood sugar concentration, just like insulin. Insulin would be your main hormone for regulating blood sugar concentration, but it's not the only one. All right, let's look at cartilage now, and this should be review because I also have this in the connective tissue lecture. We have three different kinds of cartilage. The first one, hyaline cartilage. Hyaline means glass-like. It's found in joints attached to ribs and in the respiratory tract. Hyaline cartilage is also template for bone development and bone growth especially during embryonic development. So you look at the development of the skeleton in an embryo or a fetus, let's say fetus. And first, it's made up of hyaline cartilage, and then this gets replaced by bone. Then we have elastic cartilage, which is found in the external ear, which is why your external ears are so elastic and flexible. And then also in the epiglottis, which is located on your throat. This is basically the structure that goes up when you swallow and closes the door on your airways when you swallow, right, to prevent what you swallow to go into your airways, right, which can still happen, right, when you choke. And then we have fibrocartilage, which is found between the vertebra. Basically, it's what we call the intervertebral disc. And then in the halves of the pelvis, what we call the pubic symphysis. And this is a great diagram here, just because it illustrates where the three different kinds of cartilage are located. Let's look at bones now. And bones can be classified into different types. And that classification is basically based on shape, right? So we have long bones, bones. And we might have talked about all this or some of this in the tissue chapter. Long bones are longer than they're wide and have a lot of compact bone. Remember that bone tissue, we have compact bone and then we have spongy bone, right? So they have a lot of compact bone. We've talked about the anatomy of long bones before. Then we have short bones, are cube-shaped and are mostly spongy bone. Then we have flat bones, are thin and often curved. Cranial bones, for example, the bones that make up the most of your skull, your temporal bones, your parietal bones, your frontal bones, right? So yeah, these are found in the skull, cranial bones, and have spongy bone between a very thin layer of compact bone. Then we have irregular bones, which have parts of more than one shape. The example of that we have here is vertebra, and we're going to look at vertebra later in this chapter in more detail. And then we have a rare type of bone, what we call sesamoid bones, they're not very common. They're found inside tendons. And the example that we have here on the diagram on the right, it's your kneecap or the patella would be the technical name for your kneecap. This table basically summarizes the different types of bones based on the classification in the previous slide. And it gives you examples for the different types of bones, right? Looking at the long bones, for example, yeah, your femur is probably the first long bone that we think about when we hear femur, but you know, the humerus, the ulna, the radius, the tibia, the fibula, those are all long bones. Short bones, we have carpals and tarsals, which are associated to your hands and feet, respectively. The patella is the example of the sesamoid bone. Then flat bones, the scapula and clavicles. And then if you look at the actual skeleton, you have ribs, the sternum, the skull, right? And then irregular bones, which are sort of like combinations of different shapes of bones. Your vertebra, some cranial bones, some facial bones, and then your pelvic girdle. So this is a good table to know coming into the lecture exam. In the lecture exam, you're not going to have diagrams to recognize bones, but we still want you to know the classification and which bones are long bones, which ones are short bones, and so on, but restricted to what we see here in this table. All right, let's look at the skull now. And the skull is made up of two kinds of bones. So we have cranial bones, which are the bones that protect the brain. They are the attachment site for neck muscles. We're going to talk about sinuses in the next slide, which are part of the cranial bones or located within the cranial bones. And then we have facial bones, which give structure to the face. They are the attachment site of facial muscles, which allow for your expression, and they're also the attachment site for your teeth. They contain open cavities for vision, olfaction, and gustation. These are the special senses, which we're going to study at the very end of this course. Now we have the sinuses or the paranasal sinuses, and we have here that these are open spaces inside 4 skull bones, and we're listing which ones have these paranasal sinuses: the frontal bones, the ethmoid bones, the sphenoid bone, and then the maxilla. The sinus contain tissue that it's lined up with mucus, okay? And when we look at the functions, they warm and moisten the air that we breathe. They lighten the weight of the skull. And then they enhance voice resonance. And this is why when someone is congested because maybe they have a cold or they have the flu, it's very easy to tell that they're congested just from their voice. It changes significantly when the sinuses are congested. This slide here is listing the cranial bones and then the facial bones. And I would want you guys to know these bones, which ones are cranial, which one are facial coming into the exam. Where, again, we're not giving you diagrams for you to recognize these bones, okay? That's more for the lab component of this class. I will say that one of the bones that always confuses students here is the frontal bone, which is a cranial bone because it's helping encase your skull. But because it's big part of the frontal bone makes up your forehead, then people get confused and tend to place it as a facial bone. So essentially, when we think in terms of facial bones, we're not including your forehead. It's anything that comes basically from your eyebrows going down. The next few slides here have a lot of detail on the skull, okay? Not just the bones themselves, but the name of the processes, the name of the sutures, and we're not expecting you guys to learn all this. This is way too much detail. And because of that, I'm going to simply skip through them. All right. But now we're looking at the hyoid bone. And the hyoid bone, it's a very special type of bone because it's the only bone that doesn't articulate directly with another bone. It's hiding below the mandible, your lower jaw. It almost looks like a copy, like a little clone of your lower jaw that it's hiding below it. We have that ligaments and muscles hold the hyoid bone in place. Again, it's not articulating with any other bone, which makes it unique. We have here that neck muscles used for swallowing and speaking actually attached to the hyoid bone. Let's look now at the bones of the vertebral column. There are 24 vertebrae in the adult vertebral column and divided into basically three kinds. We have cervical vertebrae. When we say the cervix or your cervical area, that's your neck. Then your thoracic vertebrae, and then you have lumbar vertebrae. So 7 are cervical, 12 are thoracic, and then 5 are lumbar. Plus, at the very bottom of the vertebral column, we have the sacrum and the coccyx. And these are actually bony structures that are formed from fused vertebrae. So if you look at the sacrum, for example, it's 5 fused vertebrae. If you look at the coccyx, it's 4 fused vertebrae. When we look at the functions of the vertebral column, support your head, the neck, the body, allows further movements, then protection of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is part of your central nervous system, right? It branches into nerves that extend throughout your body, collecting sensory information, but also at the same time sending motor information to your muscles. And then finally, another function of the vertebral column is for the attachment of ribs and muscles. When we look at cervical vertebra, and we have 5 again, but the first 2, C1 or what we call the atlas, and then the C2 or the axis, they're quite special. They're fairly different compared to the rest of the vertebrae. Like C1, for example, doesn't have what we call a spinous process, which we see in C2. It's kind of like a projection, a piece of bone that it's projecting from it. C2, the axis, has what we call the allantoid process, or just the dens, which articulates with the skull and allow the skull for rotation. All vertebrae have a transverse foramen, which is for blood vessels, and then they have the vertebral foramen, which is for the spinal cord. The spinal cord runs inside the vertebral column through the vertebral foramen. Foramen simply means hole or opening. So yeah, like we saw, the vertebral column is just one of the functions is to protect the spinal cord. Now going down from C2 and we look at the rest of the cervical vertebra, C3 through C7, they all have a bifid spinous process, which is well indicated here in this diagram. And we will see that as we move to the other type of vertebra, they're all kind of different when we compare this to, let's say, thoracic vertebra and lumbar vertebra. They're different in terms of whether the spinous process is bifid, whether the foramen is the shape of the foramen, or the shape of what we call the vertebral body, which is indicated here at the top of this slide. Looking now at thoracic vertebra, going from T1 to T12. Notice that we number them and then we put the initial, right? Cervical, 1 through 7, thoracic, 1 through 12, and so on. But anyways, when we look at thoracic vertebra, notice the difference in the size of the vertebral foramen is much smaller compared to cervical. The shape of the vertebral body is different as well. And then the spinous process, it's not bifid like in cervical. And finally, we have lumbar vertebra. Notice the differences here again in terms of the vertebral foramen, the spinous process, the vertebral body. Again, in the lecture exam, we're not going to give you diagrams or pictures for you to identify, but the last few slides kind of basically they specify the differences between the three types of vertebra, and I would like you to know that coming into the exam. And then finally, at the very bottom, then we have the sacrum and the coccyx. And like I told you, these two bones are made up of fused vertebra. And we have here that during fetal development, they're actually not fused, right? The sacrum is 5 fused vertebra. The coccyx is 4 vertebra. And again, they fuse during development. Let's look at the different types of curvatures that we see in the vertebral column. So we have the normal curvature, and we are describing curvature in terms of 4 different areas. The cervical curvature, or the curvature of the neck, the thoracic curvature, the lumbar curvature, or the sacral curvature, okay? So when we look at the normal curvatures, the abnormal ones, I'm pretty sure that you've heard about, for example, scoliosis, which is very common. It's a lateral curvature of the spine, but it's not the only abnormal curvature that we have out there. We have kyphosis, which is exaggerated thoracic curvature. And then we have lordosis, which is exaggerated lumbar curvature. And I would want you guys to know the definitions for the 3 types of abnormal curvatures. When we look at the thoracic cage, we have different kinds of ribs. If we say it's a true rib, these are the ribs that are directly attached to the sternum, to your chest bone. The sternum itself can be subdivided into 3 elements. So we have the manubrium at the very top, the body in the middle, and then at the very bottom, the xiphoid process. These true ribs are directly attached to the sternum through their costal cartilage. So it's not bone, but cartilage that attaches to the sternum. And then we have false ribs. These are ribs that are indirectly attached to the sternum. When we look at ribs 8 through 10, they attach to the cartilage of true ribs. And then 11 and 12 are what we call floating ribs because they do not attach at all. These are all well indicated in this diagram that we have on the right. All right, so everything that we covered so far has been about the axial skeleton, right? The head and the vertebral column, the ribs, right? But now we're moving into the appendicular skeleton, which includes your limbs and then your girdles, your pectoral girdle and then your pelvic girdle. So let's look at the pectoral girdle or your shoulder girdle. And this includes only 2 bones, the scapula, or basically your shoulder blades, and then your clavicles, your collarbones. So those 2, but these are pair bones. So obviously you have 1 on each side of the body. This girdle is highly mobile. Only the clavicles are anchored to the axial skeleton. We have here that this joint is very shallow and poorly reinforced, consistent with that high mobility. And there's actually a relationship when it comes to joints. An inverse relationship. The higher the mobility, then the lower the stability. And then when we look at the pelvic girdle, or the hip, your hips, right? This includes the os coxae, or the hip bone, which can be subdivided into the ilium the ischium, and then the pubis. Okay. Uh, and then it also includes your pelvic girdle and also includes the sacrum and the coccyx, which we already talked about those. This girdle is highly stable. The hip bones are heavy. The joint is very large and strongly reinforced. You have high stability, which means you have decreased mobility. Again, that inverse relationship that I described. In this slide, you just see a little more detail, the three different elements that make up your hip bones, your os coxae. So the ilium is the attachment site for many muscles. The ischium is the inferior bone of the pelvic girdle. The pubis varies the most between males and females. So yeah, you can look at the hip bones in a skeleton, and this is what anthropologists use, and they can tell when it's a male, when it's a female, by basically looking at the differences between the two, which is more clear in the next slide. In males, the opening of the hip bones is smaller and more obstructed, uh, and females is larger or less obstructed, and this makes sense because this is basically the canal for delivery during childbirth. And then if you look at the bottom part, the pubic arch is V-shaped when it comes to males, whereas it's U-shaped when it comes to females. And this concludes this lecture about the skeleton.